It's Wednesday, it's 11:15 and we're live in Westminster.
Today, I think we should be very pleased about the success of someone going voluntarily, which means that all of the nonsense about Rwanda being an unsafe country can be put to bed.
The government has paid an asylum seeker to go to Rwanda. Is that a good use of taxpayers' money? And remember this.
We would like to see net immigration in the tens of thousands rather than the hundreds of thousands. I don't think that's unrealistic.
That was 14 years ago, but now two former ministers say we should bring that target back and make it legally binding. New Brexit checks on flowers, plants, meat and dairy products have come into force. What will that mean for businesses?
Each one of these varieties will cost £29 per consignment.
So that adds up to?
Over my 3 locations, around £225,000 a year additional costs.
My guest, Stella Creasy, is trying to change the law on abortion and decriminalise it up to 24 weeks. We'll ask her why. And Rishi Sunak will face Keir Starmer at PMQs ahead of tomorrow's local elections. Joining me to discuss all that, Conservative MP and former First Secretary of State Damian Green, Labour MP Stella Creasy, former Conservative Government Advisor James Price and political correspondent for Politics Jo Ava Santina Evans. This is Politics Live. Let's start with the news you heard at the top of the headlines. BBC News covering it. Failed asylum seeker given £3,000 to go to Rwanda. Yes, this is an asylum seeker who's voluntarily gone, admittedly, with £3,000. This is not, I repeat, part of the government's deportation scheme for asylum seekers who arrive at UK shores by small boat and who will be, the government says, forcibly sent to Rwanda. It's a separate scheme altogether. Now, the timing is suspect, according to Labour. The Shadow Home Secretary, Yvette Cooper, has called it an extortionate pre-election gimmick because the story did come out yesterday exclusively in The Sun. So my opening question to the panel, starting with you, Damian, is it value for money?
Yes, because if we can persuade people who don't have a legal right to be in this country to go voluntarily, then that's cheaper than having to enforce. We have to enforce as well, and that's what will happen over the rest of the summer. Now we've got the Rwanda bill through, and I think the most significant thing, I agree, one person isn't that significant in the wider scheme of things, but I agree with Kemi Badenoch, who you had in your headlines, that the significant thing here is that people accept now that Rwanda is a safe country to send former failed asylum seekers too, and that's quite significant. That might be quite a significant point to make if somebody tries to go through the courts again.
Right. I mean, do you think it's value for money, Stella, or a rip-off for the taxpayer? £3,000 paid to this one asylum seeker to go voluntarily, but saving on, presumably, hotel accommodation.
I'm embarrassed for Damian, who I know was a former immigration minister and will know just what a bad deal this actually is, because it's not just the £3,000 this person who had been through the asylum system and found not to have a reasonable claim to stay in the UK. It's also paying for their accommodation for 5 years for free as well. And, you know, I don't know why this happened 36 hours before we have local elections and mayoral elections in this country. The British people can see through a gimmick and they can see that this is a con. This is a hugely expensive process. It doesn't prove anything about the safety of Rwanda. It proves that you can pay people. You pay for somebody who had failed to prove their claim of persecution. That's completely different to what you're talking about, which is sending people who are very vulnerable. We've also heard that a lot of the people who might be eligible for this scheme have gone missing. The government knows nowhere where they are. They have no idea
that's
about...
for the separate scheme to this
But so the idea that we're then going to send victims of torture to Rwanda who haven't yet had their claims processed. This is the thing we're talking about.
Damian,
and this is £370 million worth of public money. None of this is going to stop the boats, because you want to stop the boats, go after the people setting them off the traffic.
All right, well, let Damian respond.
We're doing that as well, and you've seen it happening, and we're spending a lot of money in France to stop the boats at source, and of course that needs to be part of it. But this idea that victims of torture are going to be sent back,
well,
that's just nonsense.
Admitted it.
If you're a victim of torture, then you're a genuine refugee. refugee. The people being sent back are not genuine
Damien,
refugees.
your policy,
there are lots of people
sorry, they've
coming
admitted
here.
today that is absolutely what's going to happen, because
They
they're going
have
to
not
process
admitted
people.
anything like that
yes,
at
they
all,
have.
and you know that's
I do know
nonsense.
that.
Let me come to James and Ava and focus on this particular story. And yes, this is the first asylum seeker, failed asylum seeker, who's voluntarily gone to Rwanda, separate to the other Rwanda bill deportation scheme. Do you think it is value for money?
I think in the grand scheme of things it is. I think the problem with £3,000 is the kind of number that normal people can grapple with. When you start talking about things costing hundreds of millions or billions of pounds, people stop being able to have a grasp of whether that's a lot of money or not a lot for the various things that these things cost. I think that if you can get somebody to go away and not start bringing in loads of other dependents who will then cost loads of money through healthcare and things like that, this person deciding to go, in addition to all the other policies as well, I don't think you can ever separate these things. So if it starts to deter behaviour in the way that we're already starting to see now with refugees and people moving to Ireland, and Ireland is now scrambling to start saying, well, the UK is actually a safe country
and they're going to return
them here again, and you can see what's happening there. You know, you're already starting to see that Rwanda policies are having these kinds of incentives and changes.
Ava, how do you view it?
I mean, I think it's about as much value for money as when I buy a £5.40 flat white on a weekend and I try and convince myself that somehow that was a good use of money. Look, you know, this wasn't £3,000. It was a lot more than that, because you've also got to pay for the flight to get over there, you've got to pay for the resettlement once he gets there, and you've also paid for him to be in a hotel for a very long time while the Home Office refused to process him in the first place. And look, you know, this is, as we've said, this is not even about the deportation scheme. This is a scheme that the government have had running now for 3 months, where they've offered voluntarily for people to go to Rwanda, and only one person out of nearly 4,000 people who were eligible has actually gone.
Are you expecting a lot more?
Yeah, I suspect more will. And some of what Ava said is valid. That of course you should process people faster. It's been one of the problems in recent years that we haven't been able to process people fast enough. And the faster you process them, and the more routes you have to get them out of the country if their claim has failed, the better. But you make the point that we're having to put them up here otherwise. So therefore, actually getting them away, even if it requires £3,000, that's only a few weeks' worth of accommodation. So it is value for money. If we're concentrating on this narrow point, I think there are other more important ones.
We're going to pick up on this issue of Rwanda, this scheme particularly, after Prime Minister's questions. But let's continue with the theme of immigration. This headline in the Daily Mail: MPs urge Rishi Sunak to use Brexit freedoms to cap migration at the tens of thousands, as they argue annual migration budget should be presented to the House of Commons. Well, one of those MPs who's in favour of the scheme is former Minister Neil O'Brien. Hello to you, Neil. First of all, we saw David Cameron, former Prime Minister, in the headlines talking about tens of thousands. That target has never, ever been hit in recent years, or since David Cameron certainly was Prime Minister. In fact, the last net migration figures were a record high for a full calendar year of 745,000. Why on earth are you going back to a failed target?
So you don't have to be particularly sceptical about migration to think that the levels that we've had over recent years are just extraordinarily high. About 1 in 60 people in this country arrived in the last year. Now, at the point where David Cameron set that goal of getting immigration back to more normal levels, the kind of levels that we had in the 1990s, there was a problem because we didn't actually control migration from Europe. We're part of the EU. And then migration from Europe was really, really high, which is why that target was missed. But of course now we can control migration from the EU, and indeed, as Eastern Europe has got a lot richer, migration from there has really levelled off. In fact, it was only about 5,000 a year net over the last 5 years. So what we've seen over recent years is a huge surge in migration from the rest of the world outside Europe. But all of those are things that we now, post-Brexit, can control and we should control.
All right, well, Neil, is it practical? How would it work for Parliament to set a legal cap, a legally enforced cap?
So through the migration rules, we control the level of migration to this country, and we have different rules that apply to people coming here for work, for different types of work, for study, for family reunification, and for other types of migration. And you can change those rules to control the total number of people coming to this country. And indeed, even over recent weeks and months, we've seen that changes to the rules can produce very large changes in the numbers. The government changed the rules on people who are coming on care visas, bringing their dependents with them, and we've seen the numbers of people doing that
Yes.
hugely falling. And so you can change these things relatively
You
quickly.
can.
And what we're
You
talking about
can.
in terms of the tens of thousands is something that used to be regarded as pretty normal.
Sure.
I mean, Britain was a country of net emigration between the Second World War and the 80s and 90s. Then it was tens of thousands in the 90s. That was a fairly normal level.
Yes,
what
but-
we've seen recently is not a normal level. It's an extraordinary level, and it's outpaced public services. It's outpaced infrastructure. It's outpaced housing in particular, but huge pressure on housing and pushed rents
All right.
upwards.
Well,
and overall, what we're arguing for is a process that is much more focused on keeping the economically beneficial types of migration, but reducing the economically damaging types of migration.
But is it actually practical or achievable? For example, let's say you had a budget, an immigration budget, as it's been called, and Parliament sets the target at 100,000, and there's a war, as in Russia invading Ukraine. What do you do then? Come back and have an emergency budget in order to take hundreds of thousands of refugees from Ukraine?
You could always choose to change your rules if you want to for a particular crisis. I had a Ukrainian family living in my house for about 6 months, and I'm very sympathetic to those types of migration. But I do think that unless we have some sort of overall numerical target, then the system doesn't have any anchor, and we don't have to have a conversation about the trade-offs. You know, do you want more family reunification migration, or do you want more migration for work, which is more economically beneficial? And unless you have some sort of overall control, firstly, the public have got no confidence that you're going to hit any of these targets.
The government does have control, and it's chosen to do, as you said, something different. I mean, why 100,000? Why that figure? I know it's a round number, but why that particular figure if there's a crisis in the care sector, for example, or the UK needs more NHS workers to come from abroad? You're never going to get close to that figure of 100,000.
So we have been at those figures, so they're historically pretty normal. And if you look at the rates of European migration we have now and the kind of levels of migration from the rest of the world we had at the start of last decade, that would get you to the tens of thousands. So it's not something that's unachievable. It's something that we used to achieve all the time.
Yeah, but not
if you
in the
look at
last
the breakdown
14
of
years.
work, there's always an argument for any particular group, but only about 15% of net migration from the rest of the world, which is almost all migration, over the last 5 years has been for work. The great majority of it has been students coming and getting around all the rules on how much you have to be earning and ending up in the gig economy, lots of family reunification and so on and so forth. So it's not clear to me that the mix at the moment is particularly economically beneficial. A lot of people who are coming still will be taking out more in public spending they receive in services, and also at the same time putting extra pressure on houses and public services and the like. So I don't think the migration mix is right at the moment, and we can control it.
Neil O'Brien, thank you very much for joining us. Is it desirable and or achievable a target of 100,000 that's never been reached in the last 14 years?
We certainly need to reduce it significantly below the 750,000 we had last year, because for everything Neil's just said, I won't repeat that. And I have a lot of sympathy with this, not least because that David Cameron target came up as a result of somebody writing a very similar pamphlet in 2008.
And who was that?
Me.
Yeah.
And I then had the full thing. You write the pamphlet and then you get made the minister responsible for it. And what we did, we inherited, I think it was about 265,000 from Gordon Brown's government. And in a few years, we got it down to 160,000. It was extremely hard work. It involved doing things like closing bogus colleges, which were the big scam of the time. Criminals produce different scams over the years. You have to keep knocking down on them.
Do you support a legal cap?
I'd be interested. I mean, I take your point about Ukraine or some equivalent to that, where suddenly you have to say, 200,000 people are going to come here who we weren't expecting to come here, but we absolutely welcome here. And Hong Kong, places like that, or indeed
Maybe
other parts
Taiwan
of the world.
could be,
Well, Syria, we took a lot of people in from Syria. So
now crossing the channel on small boats.
I think, well, a relatively small number. It's about 30,
and from Afghanistan as well.
It's about 35,000. Well,
actually, that's a really good point, because as you've just said, it's a very small number who are crossing illegally into the United Kingdom. The problem is legal migration. That's 700,000 figure that's being bandied about. That is legal. So I don't really understand why the focus has been on this Rwanda scheme and tackling small boats crossing when it's not even 10% of the number, the net number.
I completely agree. And what Neil's talking about is that legal figure. I mean, the illegal migration is clearly bad for other reasons. You want to have control of your borders.
But let's stick with the legal.
On the numbers, The difference, I mean, we got, as I said, we got it down to about 160,000. We never got down to 100,000. But Neil makes the very good point that we were inside Europe and therefore we couldn't control those numbers. And it happened, the Eurozone crisis meant that more and more young people from Spain and
people
Italy
will look at the figures and say they're, as you say, at a record time.
But they're down 24%. Today's figures show that
they have come down because you've introduced curbs. Right, you're wrong,
but we also need some truth about all of this, because you let Neil get away with making all sorts of contentions there. One of the reasons why the numbers are coming down is because there was a bulge post-pandemic of people who had gone into education, so student visas, and numbers that have been reducing because those people have finished their courses and now they are going back to their home countries. We need some honesty about the cost of the consequences of policies like this. It's not true that immigrants are taking more than they're giving to our country. In fact, it's the reverse. If you look at the actual data, particularly people coming from non-EU countries, they increase productivity. It's not hard to see why, because they don't actually come having gone through our childcare
you don't agree with Keir Starmer. You don't agree with Keir
stay.
Starmer when he says our common goal must be to help the British economy off its immigration dependency.
I agree that we need more people to be skilled, because you can't talk about any of this in its own. But we need to be honest about the cost of the consequences of what Neil is talking about. You know, is it the 9,000 doctors, the 22,000 nurses, the 100,000 care workers? He doesn't want to come here. I want to see more people being able to train. But actually, the numbers of people training to be nurses in this country are declining. It's not hard to see why. You get into huge amounts of student debt. You can't work during that time to train. We need nurses in our NHS. We are now, it's not people coming from the European Union, it's people coming from red list countries as a result of the policies of this government. So we're taking nurses and doctors from countries where actually they need those people within their healthcare system.
All right.
Well, even if you were to cut the numbers of people coming for social care, we now have massive hundreds of thousands of vacancies in our social care system. But the
Labour Party keeps saying it wants to cut the levels of net migration.
What Labour is saying rightly is that net migration should come down. And that's right, because...
So which occupations...
Can I finish my sentence?
Because you've had a long time to speak. Which of the shortage occupations would you take off the list?
I'm making a different point here, which is that when you start having these kind of policies where you separate out from the economic impact and from the skills training policy, what happens? Actually, it will cost us more. Our higher education service is already losing money because of these policies.
Well, is Stella right?
Will it
Will it cost us more? There has been an argument, a debate raging for years about immigration boosts growth. It boosts growth overall, but perhaps not per capita, per head of population. So does Stella have a point, though, that actually we'll be worse off?
I think that there's a sort of lies, damn lies and statistics here, that some immigrants bring in more growth and some bring in dependents who then cost the state in terms of education and healthcare and things like that. I think it's very clear that immigration is not a popular thing right now, and that every party since the 70s who's pledged to cut it has gone on to win and then not gone on to cut it. I think that for every person like Maya, the half, who's an American with a grown-up job in the city who wants to stay here and finds the visa system really difficult, I want her to be able to stay. I hope most people would as well. You've got lots of other people who reduce the wages of those of us in sort of less well-off bits of the country, and that we've not got a proper kind of quality over quantity approach here. And if you just look, I mean, Neil mentioned housing there. The housing crisis has been so bad, and it's been all the parties,
so that's because
local
Conservative governments haven't built enough houses.
And local councils of all kinds as well. In London, we could be building much, much more. Even if every immigrant who wanted to come here was a doctor or an AI scientist or whatever else, there's not enough houses, there aren't enough school places for their kids, healthcare places for when they get old. And so, if we don't have some kind of understanding of the numbers of people coming in, we can't provide the public service provision. And I think that was a compelling argument that made a lot of people vote to leave the EU as well.
Right, but should there be a legal cap?
I think that's when it's very difficult, because I'm inherently sceptical that government knows better than business what it can have to come in. But if you've got unlimited amounts of immigration who can come in, businesses will flex and say, right, well, we'll have lots of low-skilled people, let's say, picking fruits. But if instead you restricted immigration and you said, look, here's full expensing for the kinds of bits of technology, robots that can pick fruits and things that happen in lots of other countries, because we've got much, much less of that in the UK as anywhere else, business would flex and invest in that instead.
Ava, a legal cap on migration, whether it's set at 100,000, that's what Neil O'Brien wants, but you could set it higher.
The problem that we have is dependents that people are bringing with them when they come here. And what I don't understand is the categorisation of the cap. So if you're a care worker, you're no longer allowed to bring your dependents in. But if you're earning £5,000 more and you are a graphic designer, you're allowed to bring your entire family. So what I don't understand about the Conservative argument is that for some reason you're not a drain on the system if you're earning over £38,000, but you might have 3 children, you need to go through British schooling. But you are a drain if you're a care worker who has a partner that they would like to bring with them. I find it actually quite disgusting how we have categorised people. We decided that certain skills are more worthwhile than others.
Damien?
Well, it's a simple calculation about the amount you earn and whether you are going to be on benefits or not. Because I think one of the things that causes huge resentment among the general public, and always has done, is the thought of people come here and live off benefits.
Then why are care workers paid so little?
Day one. I can send you a massive
other
pamphlets I've written suggesting
that
care workers should be paid the same rate as NHS workers doing the same job. I think that would be a very sensible thing to do. And it is one of the when you get can I finish, Stella? When you get beyond the rhetoric of the immigration debate, which always gets very, very heated, rationally, you have to admit that if you want to bring immigration down, then you have to change things. In some professions, it will involve paying people more, and that will cost the taxpayer money. In other professions, as James has very rightly said, we need to encourage business to do more
when
automation,
will you start being
more
transparent
skills?
about how it's nothing to do with the channel crossings and it's nothing to do with Brexit or the EU, and it's a cap that you yourselves have actually set?
It's definitely not. It's not nothing to do with channel crossings.
But it isn't. There's 40,000 people.
Yeah, 40,000 people.
700,000 net.
Well, 40,000 people who are here illegally. That's a lot of people. Where are they going to live? They're not here at the moment with right documents, so we don't know where they're going to live. They disappear when they're found to have failed their claims, and they're supposed to be moving to Rwanda now, and they're disappearing off we don't know where. That's not nothing. And those people will be committing crimes as much as some of them will want to be doing things as well. As much as they maybe want to find jobs as well. That's not nothing to people.
To say that those channel crossings are anything to do with the huge number of legal migration that we have.
No, but nobody has them.
I don't know why
nothing to do with Brexit. I mean, I campaigned to remain. So I will put my cards on the table there. But it is undoubtedly true that we have more controls over the number of people we let into this country now than we had before Brexit, because we had free movement across 27 countries.
We have also introduced a points system, so that's why people are getting health and social care visas. And what's happening here is what economists would call the lump of labour fallacy. It's not one in, one out. It's that actually what comes in those skill shortages increases productivity, creates jobs. Immigrants do that.
So that doesn't work when there's nowhere for them to live.
Some do, some don't. That's the key.
Right. So that's where you have your points-based system. That's what we all agree, that you want control over immigration. But the idea that you set an independent cap which has no relevance to the consequences to our economy, to our society, is just gimmicky politics. And so they need to be honest. If they want to do this, that 100,000 isn't just about trying to stop refugees. It would also hit...
It's nothing to do with refugees.
Well, because they are including everybody in that.
Stella, can I put a question to you in terms of trust? If people are in favour, and the Labour Party certainly seems to be in favour of lowering overall the net migration figure, the Conservative governments repeatedly have not kept their promises of bringing down net migration. Why wouldn't a legal cap sort of force a government of any stripe to try and achieve it?
You can set all sorts of caps. What I'm asking for is some honesty about the consequences, what it would mean to our healthcare system, to our economy, to our we need to see higher education as an export, because actually it makes a lot of money for our economy.
Well, that is another.
You will cut the money that is available to pay for the housing to be built that we need to build.
I think that's already happening. The numbers of people coming
and
over on student visas.
And there will be less places for home students.
You've mentioned Brexit, or Ava did. Let's have a look at this headline in the Financial Times. Brexit border checks on EU imports come into force. Yes, they are coming into force after various delays on some plant and animal products from today. It will impose some costs on businesses and could mean higher prices in the shops. Let's talk to Rachna Deer. She is the owner of a cheese shop in South Glasgow called Starter Culture. They've been open for 5 years. Hello to you, Rachna. What impact will these checks have on your business?
Well, I think what was going to happen is undoubtedly will increase cost. There'll be less choice for the consumers, and there'll be an increase of empty shelves, maybe, because we won't have the product in the shop to sell.
Right. I mean, in terms of on the customers, will you have to put up prices?
Eventually we'll have to, because where else are we going to... See, we've gone through cost of living crisis. Now we've gone through utilities have trebled cost-wise. There is nowhere for a small independent shop to hide their costs. We're not a supermarket. So any cost that comes, we have to pass it on. We've not passed any utilities cost on. We've not passed any, a council tax has gone up. We've not passed that on. But where is this extra money coming from?
And is it clear to you...
We have to pass the cost on.
Well, and is it clear to you how much precisely this is going to cost you over a year?
No, it's not. There is no information available. No one has said anything to us. I'm the Small Business Federation. There's no information from them as well. So what are these costs? What is it eventually going to cost me?
Right, so you don't know. You haven't got any idea. So you're budgeting without actually knowing. But you know it is going to cost you more.
Yes.
What's the solution in your mind?
I think the solution is to get rid of those rules, because at the end of the day, what the government is saying, that they're going to cost us money and trying to make this amazing kind of beautiful biosecurity check, but we're going to have to pay for it. Why are we paying for it? Why is the government not getting money from somewhere else to pay for it?
Do you think your business is still... I mean, do you fear that your business might not be viable in the long term?
Absolutely. I mean, half my cheeses come from Europe. There's things like common cheeses, not even artisan cheeses. I'm talking about Brie, Comté, Gruyere, all are unpasteurized. Now, if these common cheeses are not going to be available, you can just forget about the artisan cheeses. And then what's going to happen to my cheese shop? I'm going to have half of them removed, because either A, I won't be able to sell them, or they'll be too expensive for the customers to buy. And then what's going to happen? They're going to go to supermarkets and buy a second-grade product. All right. And then we're not going to be there. Well,
actually, we've got Conservative MP and a Labour MP and commentators here with us. Damien, what do you say to what you've just heard there?
I think the fears that we're hearing won't happen as long as the system is efficient. And as it happens, the main place of entry where the checks are being done is in my constituency. So I visited a lot. I know the team there very well. And they are very, very alive to the point that, particularly with products like cheese, that you need it in a certain time, it can't be delayed, that they will get things through as fast as possible. And I think the basic counter-argument is that you need safety checks. We need to know that when we go into an independent cheese shop, it's all going to be safe. And your customers will want to know that, and you'll want to know that as well, because you'll want your customers to keep coming back. Right. So actually having checks on food and food products is sensible.
So why do we have? It has been safe so far. So why these new rules? And why do you want us to pay the consumer to pay for your amazing systems that you have in Kent?
I'm sure,
why can you not find the money from somewhere else?
I'm sure all your cheeses are safe, but literally earlier this week, there was a consignment of meat from Romania that was stopped at the port and was found to be contaminated. So that's coming from inside the EU. So there is sense in having our own safety checks. I think if we'd always had safety checks on food and food products at our own border, if a government said, OK, we're going to take these off and we're just going to rely on other people's checks, there would be public outrage.
Yeah, but you've just heard Rachna say that she's actually concerned about the viability of her business.
I get that, and as I say, the answer to
because of your Brexit deal
will be the efficiency of the checks. It's not the Brexit deal. It's the fact that you either check goods coming into the country or you don't.
Yeah, at a cost.
So what did we do before the Brexit rules? What happened beforehand? Why weren't we doing checks beforehand?
We were doing checks only on consignments that we thought were probably illegal, and most of this is intelligence-led at all.
You do it. But you know that for the next few weeks, all throughout summer, you're only going to be checking from intelligence base. You're not actually going to be inspecting every single van that comes in.
It's not just, well, we're never going to do that. We never did do that, and we never would do that.
Why are people paying £149 for each shipment?
Well, because you need a system of checks. If you don't have a system of checks, then you've got no control.
We need a system of checks because we've left the European Union, and therefore we can't rely on the previous checks that we had, which is what this lady had.
And will those checks go under a Labour? Will those checks go under a Labour government?
Those checks aren't happening We know today, we know a third of the paperwork that these businesses have had to create, because it's not just the common user charge that people are paying, that's the £145. It's finding a vet in the home country where that cheese is made, paying them sometimes hundreds of pounds to check it, to set their own standards, because the government hasn't actually told different European countries what standards we expect them to check to. And a third of paperwork is coming back, and it's incorrect. So as of today, they aren't checking anything, whether it's at Sevington. And that's just at Dover. Talk to people in the floristry industry who probably go through Harwich. Harwich is going to say its own. Harwich is a new jeopardy system, because you can turn up at Harwich with your lorry load of flowers. You might not pay anything at all. You might pay 50 quid for a quick check where they'll open the back of the lorry and look, or you might be lumbered with a £700 bill.
So Stella,
there are going to be very few flowers.
Sure, but can you tell, on the basis of what you've just said, under a Labour government, would Ratchner face the same?
I'm a humble backbencher, but what I'm also, Jo, is the chair of the Labour Movement for Europe, and we are campaigning for this, the Brexit border taxes to be stopped, because it's not a small increase on inflation. It's a £3 billion charge every single year, and it is going to get passed on to consumers. That's about £8 extra a month on your shopping. The small businesses, the corner shops, the delis, they're all going to go bust, and they're not even going to get the bills now. They don't even know. Well, are you talking to the British Chambers of Commerce? Are you talking to the Cold Chain Federation? Are you talking to the industries who are tearing their hair out about the costs? The supermarkets might do quite well hoovering up the business out of this, but the reality is small businesses cannot afford bills that are going to drop in about 8 weeks' time.
But
they
Stella,
don't even know what they are.
your position is clear.
Yeah,
you're right. You're a Labour MP, but under a Labour government, from what you have heard, will the situation be radically different for
Yes,
Ratchner?
because the Labour government has said that they would negotiate an SPS deal, which would cover a lot of the costs.
Well, OK, so might get rid of some of the costs, at least. What's
quite
the solution
a lot of the costs, actually, yes.
There's a free market argument that sort of says, well, if it's been checked by people that we broadly trust, and we've been told for years that the EU is wonderfully advanced in all these sorts of things, there would be no need to do these checks. But I thought it was very interesting hearing from Damien there that there was a shipment of meat from an EU country that was contaminated, and it's interesting. But I think what's really great is that we're now using this as an argument to talk about the burdens that we've got on small businesses. It's not just this at all. There are so many burdens on businesses now, the taxes that stop there being more artisanal cheese shops or whatever else there may be. So if we're interested in businesses having a burden in this sense, hopefully we'll be talking about how we can make it easier for people to do business in this country in every other way as well.
Ava?
Well, the government won't even share their findings or their estimates. They reckon that this is going to cost about £300 million. And it's, you know, most, like the Cold Food Chain Federation, they've said it could cost about £1 billion onto the consumer. What's confusing to me is that none of this seems to be costed. It seems to be rushed through, and I can't see any actual benefit. I know that you've pointed towards a meat van that was contaminated, but in the grand scheme of how many thousands of shipments come into the country every single day, it doesn't really feel like a huge issue.
I thought I'd be the radical libertarian on this panel, but hearing saying that it costs money to ensure there are high standards. I mean, if we're looking at scrapping all standards,
if they were checking, it would be one thing, but they're not checking. They're not going to check past 7 o'clock at night at most of the border control posts, which means that all the just-in-time supply chains for perishable goods, you know, you are going to see lorry loads of food.
Damien, you're shaking your head.
I've been talking to the industry, Damien, as I know you have, and they are tearing their hair out.
And it's in my constituency, and it's 24/7.
So how can you two of you have such different views as to what is actually going to happen? Oh, Stella's wrong, is she? Oh, OK. And well, explain why Stella's wrong.
Well, I think, I mean, the interesting thing, I think it was Ava said that, you know, one of them said it could be this, it could be. I agree. When you start something new, people think, what is the worst that could happen? Put a number on it and then try and stop it happening. But I am pretty confident that the common sense of everyone involved will not mean that the cheese won't get through to Glasgow in time.
Right,
and the wonder of the free market will mean that some companies will come along and come up with a better, cheaper way of doing this and make a load of money out of it as well.
Yes, but James just came in. Don't worry. Don't look hurt. I will come back to you.
Because it is insulting, because, Damien, you know full well that I have been doing a lot of work with people like the British Chamber of Commerce on this. The reality about our just-in-time perishable goods supply chains is that asking people to wait 24 hours, which is what this system does, means that those lorries will have to wait in Calais if they are going to use the short straits. That's why your colleague, Natalie, who is a Brexiteer, Natalie in Dover and I both agree this is madness, is opposing all of this, because you are going to see food stacking up that is then going to be turned around.
Let me go back to Ratchner.
No checks are happening, and we don't know when they're going to start.
We've got to move on. Let me go back to Ratchner for a final word, having heard the discussion or argument here in the studio. Ratchner?
I think what is the thing is that, A, why are we paying for it? B, I think you're saying there are going to be little charges, but there is no indication of what the charges is going to be. And C, yes, the product is going to be waiting in Calais for it to come through, and it's perishable. What if it comes to us and it can't get through anyway because it's destroyed? And then what happens? So what you're saying is, A, we have to pay more, we may not have any choice, and 3, we will probably get closed because people will not come here to buy the cheese.
All right, Rachna dear, good luck, and thanks for talking to us today. Let me show you this headline in The Guardian. Stella, MPs propose decriminalising abortion up to 24 weeks. Amendment tabled by cross-party group, including you, is latest plan to modernise abortion law in England and Wales. Why is it necessary?
Because right now, women in England and Wales don't actually have a right to have an abortion. They have a right to be exempted from prosecution if 2 doctors decide that they would go mad if they didn't have an abortion. There is no other healthcare procedure where the patient has no say in what happens to them. I think most of us who agree that abortion should be available and should be available safely recognise it's best done as early as possible. If you decriminalise, you'll make it easier to deal with some of the access problems for women to get an abortion early on.
Are you going to be supporting the amendment?
No.
Why?
I think, mostly, I mean, you might find all the issues on which Stella and I disagree. We agree on more than
we have agreed on stuff before, I promise.
Yeah. And I think that, well, I know that these days babies can be viable from 22 to 23 weeks. Medical science has advanced happily, and indeed I've seen some of them with colleagues who are broadly speaking against liberalising the abortion laws. So I don't think this is the time to be doing that. I think, in fact, there is a discussion to be had on the other end as whether 24 weeks is now the appropriate time or whether that should be reduced to 22 weeks.
Ava?
Would you decriminalise it up to 22 weeks then?
Well, I don't think decriminalisation will make much practical difference. I think having doctors involved is still
because women
sensible
can't make a decision for themselves.
Decriminalisation doesn't involve deregulation. What's happening at the moment is you have women who have stillbirths with police turning up at their hospital beds because we have a criminal underpinning to our abortion legislation. Nobody is talking about removing any medical involvement in the practice of abortion. What we're talking about is taking away the criminal law, which has a perverse incentive of meaning that women are being prosecuted in a way that, and I don't think even you would agree that women should go to prison for having an abortion, right? But that is a very real threat, and we have seen a massive spike in women being investigated and prosecuted as a result of these antiquated laws. None of that removes
how many cases?
Very clear
how many
about that.
cases? Give us an idea
so we
of the
saw
cases.
90 women in the last couple of years alone being investigated under something called Section 60. And often these are crisis pregnancies, very young women who didn't even know that they were pregnant. They don't need a police person at their door, they need a counsellor. But because of the way the law is written, that is what is happening. Right, but I want to be really clear, that is not taking away doctors or medical supervision in this at all. And it's really important that we don't suggest that is the process. We can disagree about whether it's right, but we should be clear about what we're talking about.
Well, I hope so. I just feel that given the sort of message that this would send out.
What message is that?
Well, the message is that we're liberalising the law. You don't need to involve other people, and I do think the medical involvement is.
But no one's saying
important.
that doctors wouldn't be involved in prescribing the pills. What we are saying is that women. I mean, do you think women have a right to choose what happens to their bodies?
Well, up to a point, but I mean.
Right. Well, at the moment they don't under the current legislation.
They sort of do. I mean, I think
but they don't.
Well, anyway.
Would you want 2 doctors to?
But you're not going to. You're not persuaded, and you won't be persuaded.
I'm not going to support this amendment now.
Right. I mean, there's the experience of what happened in America. It is very different there, but are there sort of genuine fears of protecting these sorts of rights here in the UK? Because I think you're also talking about a parliamentary lock. I mean, is there any sort of evidence that anything could happen, a future government, to reverse the right of women?
If anybody is comfortable with the idea that abortion rights in this country are under continual assault, they don't understand what is happening with the anti-abortion movement, the way in which it is misleading people about what decriminalisation would mean, about what is happening on the ground. Those of us who've been subject to their attacks know how much money they have and the myths that they are trying to propagate. Right. And that's what has started in America, and we've seen how effective it is there. We have to be absolutely vigilant. What we are proposing is a human right to access a safe abortion. That's very different to saying that it's abortion up to birth, for example, is one of the things. It's clearly not that.
Right. James?
That's the kind of thing they're saying.
I'm not normally in favour of the sorts of arguments to say because you're an X, you can't have an opinion on X. But I see in this that I've had the luxury as a man of not having to engage with this issue, except insofar as a kind of theoretical thing. So I found it really interesting, this idea about the need for it to be decriminalised and the arguments about whether it should be a criminal or a healthcare issue. I thought it's been really interesting to read up and learn about that. I think we should be really lucky that we've not got this sort of American-style disagreement on it. And I think that to the extent that I have strong opinions on it, I think that it's good that we take everybody on different sides of it as being in good faith. I think that for every kind of central casting preacher or kind of firebrand who's got a worrying lack of knowledge about female biology, you've got a lot of people who worry about these issues in good faith. And as long as the debate is kind of held like that, I'll sort of take that squishy middle ground. But I thought it's been very interesting about this idea of whether it should be a criminal or a healthcare issue.
Ava?
What concerns me are the bad faith arguments that suggest that this amendment that's going through this bill will allow women to have abortion right up to term, when it has never, ever stipulated that that would be the case. And it really concerns me because that's a proper import of that American-style language that we've been talking about, that sort of evangelism that we've been seeing growing, actually, amongst a number of MPs in Parliament. And that's what worries me.
How much support do you think you'll have or get?
Oh, look, I mean, this is not a party political issue.
No,
I mean, there
generally.
is support across the House for recognising that women should not be investigated and sent to prison, that we need to... I mean, what we've also said is that the Director of Public Prosecutions needs to get a handle on what happens outside of these rules. But actually protecting those late-term... I mean, the late-term cases are probably the most heartbreaking ones because often they are people who have a fatal fetal abnormality. And I just urge you, Damien, to think about the state forcing a woman to give birth to a baby she knows that is going to die, which is what happens when you've got those late-term diagnoses. What we are talking about doing is improving access at a very early age, protecting women's access as a human right, and then saying actually the DPP should be involved in anything which is considered criminal around this.
Just finally, you're looking sceptical, but we have to move on, but just finally.
Well, it's because I am sceptical, but I mean, I think the debate in this country needs to stay at a sort of reasonable and rational level. I would not want to see the debate in this country go anything like down the American route. And so, although we are on different sides of this, we can have a civilised discussion. There are, in other countries, it is quite difficult to have that civilised discussion.
Well, we will keep an eye on this, of course, and on your amendment. A few minutes up to midday, and of course, we will have Prime Minister's questions with Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer. But first of all, we're going to talk to our elections expert from Strathclyde University, John Curtis, because, John, tomorrow, unless you've been hiding under a rock and watching this programme, there are elections happening across England and Wales, local elections. You'll have the chance to elect councillors to your local authority, but also 11 mayoral contests and 37 police and crime commissioners. What's at stake?
Well, ultimately, politically, what's at stake is whether or not these local elections show any evidence of the Conservatives beginning to close the gap on Labour. The message, of course, from the national opinion polls is that the answer to that question is that they have not. If anything, indeed, the Conservative standing in the polls is weaker now than it was at the time of last year's local elections. But of course, politicians will always tell you that it's votes in real ballot boxes that matter, not the opinion polls, which are sometimes wrong. So that, in a sense, is the key political test that we'll be applying to the results when they start tomorrow night.
Right, so how much of an indication will we get of the sort of test that you have set out from these local elections?
Well, of course, we do need to bear in mind that people don't all vote in the same way in local elections as they do in a general election. About 1 in 5 do not, and the Liberal Democrats and also to some degree the Greens always do better in local elections than they do would do in a contemporaneous general election. But that said, the ups and downs of party fortunes, particularly for Conservative and Labour, do tend to follow the actual ups and downs in their national popularity. But that said, however, the contest above all, which I would regard as being least reliable indicators of what's going on, is focusing on the individual Metro Mayor contests. Those Metro Mayor contests were set up so to encourage voters not just to vote for party but for personality. There's been a lot of focus on London, West Midlands, the Tees Valley now. Of course, they're big headline makers, but they're not necessarily going to give you the best guide.
Right. And John, you'll be joining me, lucky old you, for a special election results programme on Friday from midday until at least 4:30. We're in it for the long haul, both of us. But there's no politics live tomorrow, as it is voting day. Thank you very much, and I'll be talking to you fairly soon over the next few days. John Curtis there. Now, while I was talking to John Curtis, Dan Poulter, the now former Conservative MP, has crossed the floor to join the Labour benches. He's sitting behind Keir Starmer. He made his defection public at the weekend, and actually it's the third defection from the Conservative Party, Damien, over the last few years. What's happening to your party?
Well, individuals are taking individual decisions. Lee Anderson, Dan Poulter.
Christian Wakeford was the one before in 2022.
Thank you. I'd forgotten Christian.
Yes.
But you know, stuff happens. We've had Lisa Cameron join us from the SNP, which I suspect people wouldn't have predicted. So individuals take individual decisions. I have to say, I don't find Dan's argument particularly
Which one?
Convincing.
There were a couple. Nationalist leading Conservative Party, betraying the NHS. I'm sort of paraphrasing.
Yeah.
He's a doctor. Which one didn't you agree with?
All of it.
Right.
I think both those particular arguments are wrong and ludicrous characterisations of the modern Conservative Party, and I think it's a shame. Dan and I have worked together on things in the past. I think it's a great shame he's decided to do this.
Right. I mean, it's obviously a big thing when an MP defects. Were you sad to see him go? Surprised to see him go? I mean, you're head of One Nation Conservative.
Absolutely. I was sad to see Dan go. I was sad to see Lee Anderson go, who is, Lee is, would be horrified at that probably. But in a first past the post electoral system, the major parties have to be broad churches.
Were you sad, Damien? Really, after the Islamist comment, you were sad to lose him from the Conservative Party?
People say things that I would profoundly disagree with and wish they hadn't had. But as I was saying, in a first past the post electoral system, to be a successful political party, which the Conservative Party has been for a very long time and will continue to be, then you need to have a broad church, and occasionally you need to wince at what some of your colleagues say. And I'm sure Stella finds that about some of her colleagues in the Labour Party.
Stella, can I ask you about Dan? But can I ask you about Dan Poulter? I mean, obviously pleased that someone has defected from the Conservative benches to Labour's benches, but of course he was there during austerity years, as you would call it. How has the Labour Party adjusted its feelings about that? Well,
one of the things I'm sure your viewers know is that Dan has also been working in A&E throughout his time as an MP, and I think that's why with respect, Damien, when you say it's nonsense, I think he probably has more first-hand experience of what it's like.
PMQs.
Mr. Speaker, I know that the thoughts of the whole House are with the people of Hainault in East London following yesterday's appalling attack. Such violence has no place on our streets. It's absolutely heartbreaking that a teenage boy has died, and I can't imagine what his family are going through. And we send them our heartfelt condolences and offer our very best wishes to all those injured. And I'd just like to reiterate my thanks to the police and other emergency first responders for embodying the highest standards of public service under such awful circumstances. And I know that our thoughts are also with those injured this morning in an attack at a school in Sheffield. Mr. Speaker, this morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others in addition to my duties in this House. I shall have further such meetings later today.
Kirsten Osborne. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We already know that more than 1 in 5 teenagers are vaping, with some experts describing this as an epidemic. And yesterday, new research suggested that teenagers who vape could be at risk of exposure to toxic metals, potentially harming brain or organ development. I agree with the Prime Minister in his wish to reduce the harms caused by smoking and vaping with the Tobacco and Vapes Bill. Will he agree with me that permitting football strips to be sponsored by vaping companies sends entirely the wrong message to young people, and that it's now time to ban vape companies advertising on sports strips?
Well, Mr. Speaker, can I thank the Honourable Lady for her question. Obviously, your decisions about kit sponsorship will rest with individual teams, but I do agree with her that it is important we do everything we can to tackle the scourge of teenage vaping, which is why I'm glad that she supports our bill, which will clamp down on the marketing, availability of flavours, targeting point-of-sale purchases, but also improving funding for trading standards to clamp down on those selling vapes illegally to children.
Dr. Lisa Cameron.
Many thanks, Mr. Speaker. My husband is a veteran, and the defence of the country is the government's first duty to protect people across the United Kingdom. So can the Prime Minister reassure the House that he has a plan in place to back our world-leading armed services? And does he know why the party opposite refused to back his plan?
Well, can I start by paying tribute to my honourable friend's husband and all our veterans for their service to our country. And she's right, in the most uncertain times since the Cold War, that it's right that we build our security, protecting our values, our interests, and indeed our nation. That's why this government has taken the step to increase defence spending to 2.5% of GDP, making us the biggest spender in Europe under NATO. And when the Labour leader stands up, I hope that he stops dithering, does the right thing, and confirms that he will back our plan to increase defence spending.
Leader of the Opposition, Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, I join with the Prime Minister in his words about yesterday's awful events at Hainault. I'm sure the whole House will want to commend the first responders and send our deepest condolences to the family of the 14-year-old boy who was murdered. And I join with the Prime Minister's remarks about the attack in the school in Sheffield as well. I know everyone in this House will be delighted to see His Majesty the King returning to his public duties and looking so well, and we all wish him and the Princess of Wales the best in their continued recovery. I'd also like to welcome the member for Central Suffolk and North Ipswich to his place on these benches. After nearly 2 decades as a Tory politician and an NHS doctor, Mr. Speaker, he's concluded that if you care about the future of our country and our NHS, then it's time for change. It's time for this changed Labour Party. And as of today, he's our newest Labour MP, but I'm sure he won't mind me saying that I hope he loses that title on Friday. Mr. Speaker, when a lifelong Tory and doctor says that the only cure for the NHS is a Labour government, isn't it the time the Prime Minister admits he has utterly failed?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm glad to actually see the honourable gentleman from Central Suffolk in the House today. That's because he recently pointed out that residents of his local Labour council are, and I quote in his words, charged much more in council tax, but in return receive lower quality services. Now, he's been wrong about some things recently, but on that point, he's absolutely right. And this week, people everywhere should vote Conservative.
He comes out with all that nonsense, but he locks himself away in Downing Street bunker, moaning that people aren't grateful enough to him. The reality is Tory MPs are following Tory voters in concluding that only the Labour Party can deliver the change that the country needs. And I say to those Tory voters, if they believe in a better Britain, then they're safe with this changed Labour Party, and it's for them. Mr. Speaker, in the 2 weeks since we last met at this dispatch box, has the Prime Minister managed to find the money for his completely unfunded £46 billion promise to scrap national insurance?
Mr. Speaker, of course, we addressed that a few weeks ago, and I'm happy to address it again. But I know that economics is not his strong point, but he might do well. He might do well, actually, to listen to a shadow education secretary who just this morning said, no, that's not how it works, Mr. Speaker. Indeed, the IFS have also said the link between national insurance and public services funding is illusory, just like Labour's economic plans, Mr. Speaker. But it's crystal clear. There's one party that's going to deliver tax cuts for working Britain, and it's the Conservative Party.
That was a long ramble.
Order. Whoever's banging the furniture will have to pay for your damages. Can we have less of it? We are not at the sixth floor now. Come on,
Well, that was a long, rambling non-answer to the question, which was, has he found the money to fund his £46 billion promise to abolish national insurance? And whenever he's asked about the date of the election or people's pensions, he acts as if answering straightforward questions is somehow beneath him. But pensioners and those who are planning their retirement deserve better than his contempt for their questions. Because if £46 billion were cut from its funding, the value of the state pension would almost halve. So I don't apologise for asking him again.
Order. Mr. Gullis, you've got the next question you're not going to reach. You've got a 10-minute rule bill. I'd be quiet for a while if I were you. Prime Minister. Sorry, Leader of the Opposition.
So I don't apologise for asking on their behalf again whether he will finally rule out cutting their state pension to fulfil the enormous black hole in his spending plans.
Mr. Speaker, of course we can rule that out, and the honourable gentleman should stop scaremongering, because it's thanks to the triple lock that we've increased pensions by £3,700 since 2010, and they will rise in each and every year of the next Parliament. But it's Labour that always hits pensioners hard. It's his mentors, Blair and Brown, that broke their promises, raised pension taxes by £118 billion and delivered an insulting 75p rise in the state pension. As one former Labour advisor just said, Brown destroyed our pension system. They did it before, they'll do it again. Labour always betray our pensioners.
Mr. Speaker, it's clear he can't answer the question where he's going to find this £46 billion. No, he said, luckily for him, that's where he said it's not coming from. It's not said where it's coming from. Luckily for him, one of his peers, Lord Frost, yes, him again, does. He says to solve the Tory spending plans, the state pension age should be raised to 75. Now, understandably, that will cause some alarm. So will the Prime Minister rule out forcing people to delay their retirement by years and years in order to fulfil his £46 billion black hole?
Mr. Speaker, I've answered this multiple times to the Honourable Gentleman. I'm happy to say again, this is the party that has delivered and protected the triple lock. But I know, Mr. Speaker, ultimately he's not worried about any of this, because we all remember that he's got his very own personal pension plan. I think we all remember it, Mr. Speaker. Indeed, it comes with its very own special law. It was called the Pension Increase Scheme for Keir Starmer QC. It's literally one law for him and another one for everyone else.
He wants to abolish national insurance. It'll cost £46 billion, and he won't tell us where the money is coming from. We're no closer to an answer. I'm going to persevere, because last year the Prime Minister was apparently drawing up plans to remove the winter fuel allowance from pensioners. His Paymaster General went a step further. He said these are the sorts of things that we need to look at. So will he now rule out taking pensioners' winter fuel payments off them to help fund his £46 billion black hole?
Mr. Speaker, it was this government that just this winter provided double the winter fuel payment to support pensioners. But what is crystal clear, Mr. Speaker, is that we believe that the double taxation on work is unfair, Mr. Speaker. We believe that hard work should be rewarded, and that's why this week we're cutting taxes by £900 for everyone in work. But in contrast, Mr. Speaker, it's Labour's newest tax advisor who thinks pensioners should be taxed more. That's his words, Mr. Speaker. This advisor calls them codgers. He thinks that supporting them is a disgrace. And he believes that their free TV licences are ridiculous, Mr. Speaker. It's Labour who hit pensioners with tax after tax, and they would do it all over again.
Mr. Speaker, is it any wonder that his MPs are following Tory voters in queuing up to dump his party? And even the mayors that he's apparently pinning his political survival on don't want to be seen anywhere near him. Because until he starts setting out how he's paying for his fantasy economics, he's got a completely unfunded £46 billion promise that puts people's retirement at risk. How does it feel to be one day out from elections with the message, vote Tory, risk your pension?
Well, Mr. Speaker, tomorrow voters will have a choice, and it will be a choice. It will be a choice between mayors like Andy Street and Ben Houchen who are delivering, or mayors like Sadiq Khan who just simply virtue signal, Mr. Speaker. It's higher taxes, more crime and ULEZ with Labour, or it's lower taxes and better services with the Conservatives. That's the choice. From West Midlands to Teesside to London, there is only one choice. Vote Conservative.
Mr. Speaker, we concede the Rwanda deterrent is working, and we've now deported our first illegal migrants. But unsurprisingly, Labour just don't care. The Shadow Home Secretary is busy posing for pics, encouraging more boats to come over. The leader of the Labour Party said he would cancel the Rwanda flights. He took a knee when signing letters stopping us deporting illegal foreign national offenders who committed crimes like murder and rape. And he'd do a deal with the EU, surrendering our borders to 100,000 legal migrants. Isn't it right, Prime Minister, that only the Conservatives will stop the boats and cut legal migration?
Well, my honourable friend is absolutely right, Mr. Speaker. Our plan is working. Legal migration, the latest figures show, down by 24%. Student dependence down by 80%. But we all know Labour's big idea. It's to scrap the Rwanda plan, even when it's operational, Mr. Speaker. But as one senior Labour advisor said to Andrew Marr just yesterday, we can't just come in, tear it up and have nothing to put in its place. I'm sorry to break it to them, but that's exactly their policy. While we're getting on stopping the boats, all Labour would do is stop the planes.
SNP leader Stephen Flynn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On Monday, the Armed Forces Minister was neither able to confirm nor deny that UK troops may soon be deployed on the ground in the Middle East. Now, the public watching will be hoping that members of this House do not have a short memory when it comes to the potential deployment and involvement of our military in the Middle East. So can I ask the Prime Minister to provide some much-needed clarity? Is he giving active consideration to the deployment of UK forces in the Middle East, yes or no?
Mr. Speaker, you wouldn't expect me to get into any operational planning details, but what I will say is we are absolutely committed to supporting international efforts to get more humanitarian aid into Gaza, which is something I think the whole House would support by land, sea and air. We've obviously tripled our aid commitment, and right now, together with the US, Cyprus and other partners, we're setting up a new temporary pier off the coast of Gaza to get aid in as securely and quickly as possible.
Stephen Flynn.
Mr. Speaker, let's all be in no doubt. Aid is required in Gaza, and it is required because when people are not being bombed, they are starving to death. The solution to that is a ceasefire and the opening of safe ground air routes, not the involvement on the ground of UK military personnel. These are dramatic and potentially dangerous developments. So will the Prime Minister confirm to the House today that before he makes a decision, all members will be afforded a vote?
Mr. Speaker, I'm not going to apologise for our armed forces playing a leading role in supporting international efforts to get more aid in. And indeed, we are sending Royal Navy support ship, RFA Cardigan Bay, to the region to support that effort. But when he talks about this conflict, the fastest way to end this conflict is to ensure that we have a hostage deal that gets hostages out, aid in, and for there to be a sustainable pause in the fighting. And it seems clear that there now is a workable offer on the table. So I hope he joins with me in encouraging all parties, including Hamas, to accept that deal so we can move towards a sustainable solution.
Sir Bill Wigan.
My right honourable friend's decision to cancel HS2 led to £207 million for Herefordshire's potholes and transport infrastructure. Hereford Hospital has a new wards, more beds and a new diagnostic centre on the way. £35 million has been allocated to the River Wye recovery plan. Inflation is down, the Rwanda bill has been passed, and defence spending is increasing. Does my right honourable friend agree with me that if he carries on like this, he's going to win the next election?
Mr. Speaker, I'm thankful for my honourable friend in highlighting the work that the government's doing, whether that is increasing our defence spending to keep us safe, securing our borders with our Rwanda Act, cutting taxes by £900, raising the state pension by £900. And I'm also pleased that locally in Herefordshire we are filling in potholes, helping to save the River Wye and improving local health services. It shows crystal clear that it's the Conservative government that has a plan and is delivering a brighter future for our country.
Caroline Lucas.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. In February, his Foreign Secretary said it would be difficult for a ground offensive on Rafah to avoid harming civilians and destroying homes. Just yesterday, his Deputy Foreign Secretary admitted he was struggling to see how such an attack could be compliant with international humanitarian law. All the signs are that Netanyahu is about to defy the international community. An attack on the 1.5 million Palestinians sheltering in Rafah is imminent. If that attack begins, will that be the moment when the Prime Minister finally finds the moral backbone to ban arms exports to Israel? And if not, how much more suffering has to happen before he acts to prevent further UK complicity in crimes against humanity?
Well, Mr. Speaker, what the Honourable Lady did not acknowledge at all is that Israel suffered an appalling terrorist attack that kills hundreds of its citizens, and it does have the right to defend itself. Now, of course, as I've been crystal clear, we want to see humanitarian law respected and adhered to by all parties. Too many civilians have been killed, and we do want to see Israel take greater care to avoid harming civilians. I've made these points repeatedly to Prime Minister Netanyahu, specifically about the impacts of any military incursion into Rafah, and we continue to say to the Israelis at all levels that we want to see more aid going in and bring about a hostage deal so we can move towards a sustainable ceasefire.
Andrew Slew.
The 60% increase in funding for special educational needs and disabilities is extremely welcome, but the challenges around the recruitment of community paediatricians mean that some children in Leighton Buzzard, Dunstable and Houghton Regis are waiting too long for an assessment. What can the NHS do to attract more of the 39,000 additional doctors recruited under this government into community paediatrics as a specialty, which is incredibly rewarding and important?
Oh, my honourable friend is right, and I know he joins me in welcoming the significant action that we've taken already to improve children's health, whether that's reducing sugar in children's foods, but the £600 million we've also invested to improve the quality of sport and physical activity in schools. The NHS has established a special group to ensure that the recovery of paediatric services keeps pace with that of adult elective care too, and I know that he will be pleased that the NHS long-term workforce plan that we have fully backed doubles the number of medical school places in England, increases specialty training places, and that will increase the size of the pool from which community paediatricians can be drawn in the future.
Alistair Carmichael.
Thank you. I know that you, Mr. Speaker, want to join me in sending condolences to the friends, family and colleagues of our former colleague Lord Andrew Stunnell, who served with exceptional diligence and grace as MP for Hazel Grove in this House and who passed away very suddenly on Monday. Mr. Speaker, when the BBC ends long-wave radio transmission next year, they will also end access to electricity tariffs like total heating with total control, relied on by almost 1 million households across the United Kingdom. Switching to smart meters is not going to fix this for most people, not least because the rollout programme is so far behind. So will the Prime Minister or possibly His Secretary of State for Energy get the energy companies, the regulator and the customer groups together so that we can stop passing the blame around and find a solution that does not yet again leave people in the Highlands and Islands behind and out in the cold.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I understand that an agreement has now been reached to ensure that radio teleswitching services will continue until June of next year, and Ofgem are also engaging with energy suppliers on their plans to support consumers through the transition. Whilst households that are currently covered by the service shouldn't be disadvantaged by the switch off, it's energy suppliers who are best placed to advise on tariffs for those who have been switched to a smart meter. However, I will make sure that the right honourable gentleman does get a meeting with the relevant minister to ensure that his constituents are not left behind during the transition.
Peter Aldis.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The East of England is playing a lead role in delivering the UK's energy security, and without our contribution, the country will not be able to successfully transition to a renewable energy supply system. In recent months, our coast has taken a battering, and projects like the Lowestoft Flood Defence Scheme have been postponed. Will my right honourable friend ensure that government departments are fully coordinated so as to provide the region with good supporting infrastructure, proper protection for coastal communities, and every opportunity for local people to take up exciting new jobs?
Mr. Speaker, we are levelling up across the United Kingdom and investing in places that need it most, including, as my honourable friend rightly highlights, our coastal communities. Almost £1 billion of levelling up funding has been allocated to the East of England, including £75 million for coastal places. I know that he welcomes the town deal for Lowestoft in particular, but I will ensure that my honourable friend gets a meeting with the relevant minister to discuss how we can further support his region, its role in our energy security, but particular its coastal communities.
Deirdre Brown.
Mr. Speaker, the Greenpeace group Unearthed found 36 supposed grassroots campaign groups which were actually administered by Conservative staff and activists and were forums for vile racism, anti-Semitism and Islamophobic attacks on Sadiq Khan. Now, one hears of other such coordinated efforts around anti-20-mile-per-hour zones in Wales. Can the Prime Minister shed some light on these shady groups spreading abuse, their funding, their links to his party, and whether he is aware of similar operations existing elsewhere in the UK? If he won't, will he at least commit today to investigate and take action to tackle the sources of this grubby gutter politics?
Mr. Speaker, I'm not aware about the topic that the honourable lady raises, but I'm not going to make any apology for Conservatives pointing out the record of whether it's the SNP in Scotland or the Labour government in Wales, because that's exactly what democratic process is about. She might not like it when we highlight their record, but we will keep doing so that we can deliver for people across the United Kingdom.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I welcome our government's commitments to boosting defence spending and supporting Ukraine, made possible by this Conservative Prime Minister's international leadership and sound management of the economy. My constituents have been doing us proud supporting Ukraine, like the Pot Place Garden Centre delivering ambulances, medical equipment and supplies, and Steve Hodgson providing vital aid. Would the Prime Minister join me in paying tribute to my constituents and people up and down the land for their support for Ukraine, and reaffirm that we will continue to stand with Ukraine for the sake of freedom, democracy and global security?
I join my honourable friend in thanking people up and down the country, including the fantastic work of his constituents in supporting the Ukrainian community in the face of Putin's illegal invasion. We remain steadfast in support of Ukraine, and in total, since the war began, we've pledged over £12 billion of aid to Ukraine. Last week, we announced an additional £500 million of funding, which will be used to deliver much-needed ammunition, air defence and engineering support and drones. But more importantly, and President Zelensky welcomed this, we are able to now say that we'll continue with this level of support for as long as it takes because of the historic increase in our defence spending. And it's crystal clear that on this side of the House, we can say that our support to Ukraine will never waver.
Margaret Raymer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In 1969, my constituent Georgina Jacobs gave birth to a baby boy who she named Robert. Sadly, Robert was born asleep, and in those days the hospitals would ask the father to collect the baby's body, take it to the cemetery and leave it there for burial. For 53 years, Georgina didn't know exactly where Robert was buried. When she eventually found him, she shared her story on social media, and other mothers who'd been through the same experience got in touch. Since then, Georgina has located over 60 babies on behalf of grieving parents and has deservedly been presented with the Wirral Award for her achievements. Will the Prime Minister join me in congratulating Georgina on her award and on having brought comfort to so many parents and families? And will he, on behalf of all previous governments, apologise for this former practice which left grieving parents with nowhere to visit their buried children?
Well, can I thank and commend the Honourable Lady for raising this case and just pay tribute to Georgina for what she is doing. I often say that one of the most incredible things about doing this job is meeting people like Georgina who have suffered tragedy in their lives, but then use that to campaign and inspire and bring about a better life for everyone else. She's a prime example of that. She deserves nothing but our praise and admiration, and I'm so pleased that she's brought comfort to so many other people too.
Palsy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, since I was elected in 2010, Rugby's seen employment grow by nearly 6,000, with 10% more of my constituents in work, much of which has been driven by investment from advanced manufacturing in places such as Anstey Park, where we've got the Manufacturing Technology Centre, which the Prime Minister visited, High Temperature Research Centre, Rolls-Royce, Parker Meggitt, Fanuc and the London Electric Vehicle Company. Given that every Labour government has left office with unemployment higher than when they came in, can the Prime Minister see any reason why anybody would want to put this fantastic progress at risk?
I was pleased to see for myself on a recent visit that my honourable friend is a great champion for his constituents in Rugby, and I was very pleased to see the thriving local technology and manufacturing industry, which will help us deliver on our ambitions to make the UK a science and technology superpower. And he's right that we do have a record with 1 million fewer workless households, unemployment near record lows, and he's also right that we need to stick to that plan, because that's how we'll deliver the long-term change that our country needs and deliver a brighter future for families up and down the country, including in his constituency.
Colin Lockhart.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Hypocrisy needs called out, and everyone in this House will recall the former Irish Prime Minister in Brussels with a photograph of a bombed customs post, lamenting that any border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland was unworkable, it was in breach of the Belfast Agreement and could result in such troubles again. The hypocrisy of the Irish government from such a position has not been lost, with the Irish police now tasked to patrol the border, protect from the unsubstantiated, unfounded 80% figure of asylum seekers who supposedly make their way to the Republic of Ireland from the UK via Northern Ireland, when actually the reverse is true. Will the Prime Minister challenge and call out these actions and confirm what representations he has made to the Irish Prime Minister and the Justice Minister to respect the integrity of our UK and our border?
Well, the House will be aware that we have made commitments to avoid a hard border on the island of Ireland, and the Honourable Lady makes a very important point that the Irish Government must uphold its promises too. We can't have cherry-picking of important international agreements, and so the Secretary of State is seeking urgent clarification that there will be no disruption or police checkpoints at or near the border, and I can confirm that the United Kingdom has no legal obligation to accept returns of illegal migrants from Ireland. Now, it's no surprise that our robust approach to illegal migration is providing a deterrent, but the answer is not sending police to villages in Donegal. It's to work with us in partnership to strengthen our external borders all around the common travel area that we share.
So Desmond Swain.
Mr. Speaker, I was the Lord Commissioner that signed the Right Honourable Gentleman's special pension into law. He owes me one. But the Prime Minister is right. Labour's 75 pence was an insult to pensioners. Yet last year, our triple lock afforded pensioners the highest increase in 30 years. The Prime Minister is going to continue to deliver for dignity in retirement, isn't he?
Well, my right honourable friend is absolutely right that we will provide dignity to all those in retirement. That's why we introduced the triple lock, and that's why this year the state pension is rising by £900. I'm also proud of our record to bring 200,000 pensioners out of poverty, and I can also say, as I've said previously, that the state pension will increase in each and every year of the next Parliament. And as he reminds us about the 75p increase, unlike Labour, pensioners in this country can trust the Conservatives.
Mr. Speaker, in only one of the 194 local authority areas in England are NHS ambulances meeting the national response time targets for responding to potential heart and stroke victims. Does the Prime Minister know which one it is?
Mr. Speaker, when it comes to ambulance waiting times in A&E, of course there's more work to do, but the place where they are the worst in the country is in Labour on Wales, Mr. Speaker. Thanks to our plan, we've seen an improvement in A&E and ambulance times. This winter over last winter, we have 800 more ambulances on the road, faster discharge out of our emergency care centres, and 10,000 virtual ward beds. Now, virtual ward beds. Of course, as I said, there is more to do, but the contrast to Labour on Wales is crystal clear. It's the worst A&E performance anywhere in Great Britain.
Mr. Speaker, for 6 months, thousands of my constituents have lived with foul, polluted air from the Withyhedge landfill site. The company is owned by somebody with previous convictions for environmental crimes and who, a few months ago, gave £200,000 to help Vaughan Gething become First Minister of Wales, after another of his other companies was loaned £400,000 from the Development Bank of Wales, overseen by the then Economy Minister, Vaughan Gething. Does the Prime Minister agree with me that this serious matter demands an independent investigation? It's not some internal Labour Party matter, and ultimately that company needs to get out of my constituency and let people in Pembrokeshire have their quality of life back.
My right honourable friend brings up an incredibly important issue, and I know that people in Wales are concerned about the relationship that he mentions, and I also agree with him on the need for transparency and an investigation regarding the Welsh Labour leader, because it's very clear that the situation is not at all transparent and answers are needed.
Mr. Speaker, it's been revealed by the Observer newspaper that the Conservative candidate for the Mayor of London is actually a member of the 6 Facebook groups which was mentioned by the member for Edinburgh North. And they are full of Islamophobia, anti-Semitism and the most disgraceful incitement to damaging property. And the worst bit, for those of us who were in the House when our members of Parliament were taken, death threats to the current Mayor of London, Mr Khan. Will he close down these Facebooks which have been begun by Conservative members of staff, and will he investigate the role of the current candidate and her membership of those disgraceful racist Facebooks?
Well, Mr. Speaker, the election tomorrow will be fought on the substance of the issues that Londoners face, and the Labour record is crystal clear. House building in London has collapsed. Knife crime is rising. Mayoral taxes are up 70%, and drivers have been hit with ULEZ charges. And the Labour mayor just simply panders to unions and has decimated London's nighttime economy. That's his record. That's how he'll be judged. And people across London know that they will be safer with the Conservatives, with lower taxes and better services.
Final question, Karen Bradley.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Today, Mr. Speaker, is Staffordshire Day, where we celebrate all the brilliant things about the county of Staffordshire. So would my right honourable friend join me in paying tribute to our brilliant Police, Fire and Crime Commissioner, Ben Adams, and encourage the people of Staffordshire to vote for Ben tomorrow to make sure we keep Staffordshire one of the safest places to live, work and visit?
Well, I wish everyone a happy Staffordshire Day. And she mentions the PCC elections, and I think it's right that she does, because under this Conservative and previous governments, we've cut crime by over 50%, delivered 20,000 more police officers, but people with a Labour Police and Crime Commissioner are more likely to be victims of burglary, twice as likely to be victims of robbery, and as I said, last year, knife crime in London went up by 20%. The facts simply speak for themselves. Vote Conservative Alternative for Safer Streets.
That completes Prime Minister's question.
Well, that brings us to the end of what turned out to be a rowdy pre-election Prime Minister's questions. Familiar lines being trotted out by both the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition, Keir Starmer, who did focus his questions on what he and the Labour Party are calling the Tories' unfunded £46 billion project to scrap national insurance. And we'll come on to that in a moment. But first of all, let's go back to just before Prime Minister's questions, as I mentioned, and there is, as always, when someone defects from one party to another, a dramatic moment in terms of parliamentary staging. And I'll talk to you, Henry, about it in a moment, but I think we can show you when Dan Poulter, former Conservative MP who announced his defection to Labour at the weekend, crossed the floor to join the Labour benches just before PMQs. Let's have a look at it. It is dramatic. Defections are always a big deal. We can see here Dan Poulter making his way to sit behind Keir Starmer, obviously gleeful for Labour and very much disappointment for Conservative benches, particularly in the run-up to elections.
Absolutely. And Dan Poulter, who's been a Conservative MP, or had been a Conservative MP, I should say, since 2010, I think really came out of nowhere for most people. He certainly wasn't on anyone's radar as a sort of defection risk. He's in a seat, Central Suffolk and North Ipswich, which is true blue territory rather than a sort of Labour Conservative marginal. And look, you're right to say defections are always dramatic. But this kind of defection, directly from the government to the main opposition party, is very rare. We had one 2 years ago. Christian Wakeford went from Labour to the from the Conservatives to Labour. But before that, the last time someone had gone from the governing party to their main opposition was 1995. So it is very rare, and I think quite significant.
Yes, and actually I've realised I've forgotten to introduce our guest, Hugh Merriman, for the Government Transport Minister, in the excitement of what was going on in Parliament, and for the Labour Party, the Deputy National Campaign Coordinator, Ellie Reeves. Welcome to both of you, and Henry Zeffman, the BBC's Chief Political Correspondent. In fact, Ellie, let's show the moment, in fact, that Dan Poulter signed up to the Labour Party. Were you surprised, by the way, in the way Henry said? Did it come out of nowhere?
I think that, Dan obviously had been thinking about it for a while, and for him what he said is that he couldn't look his constituents or his colleagues in the NHS, he works part-time in the NHS, in the eye while sitting as a Conservative Member of Parliament, because he felt they had failed, particularly on mental health, and that only Labour had a plan to get the NHS back on its feet.
I mean, he was a health minister, Dan Poulter, during the years that you have long labelled austerity years in terms of public services. Do you really want him in the Labour Party, someone like that, who backed the austerity that you have criticised for so long?
Well, look, Dan's experience on the front line on the NHS, I think, is really important. But also, we're a big tent in the Labour Party, and if disaffected Tories feel as though that actually a changed Labour Party is the place for them, then, we welcome Dan Poulter and his NHS experience.
Right. What does this say about the state of your party, the Conservative Party?
Well, I'm sorry to see Dan go. He was someone I campaigned with up in Norwich, actually, on his for his constituency neighbour against Labour, and Chloe Smith held that for us. So I was door-knocking with him, telling sort of residents why they'd be better off with a Conservative MP, and they accepted that at the ballot box. And Dan was doing that, and then the next thing, he's not.
Right.
And he's joined Labour, so I find it quite puzzling.
Yes. Are you surprised, then?
Well, I'm surprised because he's been a Conservative MP for 14 years. He'd already announced, I believe, that he was standing down. And then the last sort of few months before an election, he decides he'll leave the party. And I don't know, the rumours are that he's cut a deal and he'll become Lord Poulter, but it just seems very odd. I mean, well, you say no.
Well, except he has been extremely critical, hasn't he, in the way that Ellie has said about the state of the NHS under Conservative governments. And he went on to say that the Conservative Party has become a nationalist party. You've lost your compassion. It's pretty damning, isn't it?
Well, I think you can actually look at both of those parts and tie them together as a reason why that's not the case. So if you look at mental health funding, that's 9% now of the NHS budget. The NHS budget is £160 billion, which is a record amount.
Look at the number of people on waiting lists.
But we've increased the amount of funding for the NHS. And again, you look at Scotland, that's run by the SNP, it's got poorer performance. Labour Wales, poorer performance than England. So it's unusual for Dan to go over to a Labour party talking about the NHS being an issue when it's a bigger issue in Wales.
Was he offered anything, Dan Poulter?
No, he's not been offered anything.
Nothing at all, because there was a talk of a peerage down the line, because he's stepping down at the election, so he's not going to continue as an MP. So nothing at all.
He's not being offered anything, and this is about Dan's conscience and Dan being really clear that this is about fixing the NHS and wanting a Labour government to do that. And Hugh talks about mental health, but the reality, for my constituents, I get contacted by parents who are desperate because their children have been on waiting lists for 6 months or more to get the mental health support that they need. People aren't getting the help that they need.
Right, so you can rule out that Keir Starmer at any point will be offering Dan Poulter a peerage?
There's absolutely no deal has been done with Dan Poulter. He's doing this because of the NHS.
Let's talk about this national insurance story. It's come up before. It was something that Jeremy Hunt, the Chancellor, talked about in the budget. It seemed like something a long way off, an ambition to scrap national insurance, but it has given Labour the opportunity to say it's unfunded and how would you pay for it? It's going to leave this £46 billion black hole.
I mean, we've discussed before, the government's position on this is a bit unclear. It was mentioned by Jeremy Hunt in his budget speech, but not in the actual budget, and he raised the prospect of moving towards abolishing national insurance because in 2 successive, what are called fiscal events, first the autumn statement, then the budget, the government cut national insurance by 2p. Obviously, it's significantly lower than it was. But whether the government, whether the Conservatives are talking about abolishing it over a few years, over a few decades, is completely unclear. Clearly, the political benefit that they wanted from that was to be able to say, look, taxes will keep falling. But they also seem to have presented Keir Starmer with what he thinks is a political opportunity, which is to question over what time frame and how it would be funded.
Right, is it time for the government to come forward with a plan now?
Well, we've been quite clear with what we are looking to do, and we have done. A £900 tax cut, that's a third of the NI taken out, and that's funded. It's been done through the budget. So it's £9 billion. The budget is there, it gets scrutinised, and that is funded. And so we will look in the future at being able to do that more.
But how far into the future?
Well, I mean, so it's an ambition for our party, and it's a good one as well, to end the double taxation on workforce. And so, therefore, if over time we can continue to find the funding to be able to reduce it further, then we would look to do so. But those will be for manifesto ideas. But we've demonstrated with the 2 cuts that we've done so far up to £900 that this is the type of decrease we like to see because it encourages work.
Right, you think it's a good idea. Let's have a look at this headline in the Daily Telegraph. Scrapping national insurance was ruled out by Nigel Lawson, memo shows. Obviously very historic. Nigel Lawson, a key former Chancellor and late Chancellor under Margaret Thatcher. Note from 1986 resurfaces via Labour, which is focusing its fire on Tory plan to end double taxation. He said it was a terrible idea.
Well, our view is if you reduce the burden on workers in terms of taxation, it encourages more workers to work. And they are at the moment double taxed, so therefore it seems the right reduction for us. And also, you look at the working age population, that's a group that we want to help in terms of getting onto the property ladder, allowing people to save up a deposit for a home of their own. This is the kind of reduction in tax that allows them to do so.
Right, well, what's wrong with this as a long-term ambition and idea?
Well, it's reckless. It's an unfunded commitment that's been made. It feels like it's a repeat of the Liz Truss mini-budget that crashed the economy.
It's not the same, is it? It's not actually going into
Jo,
the budget.
you know, if Labour put forward proposals for a £46 billion unfunded tax cut, the questions would be asked, where on earth is this going to be paid from? And, I think it's absolutely right that we question it. There's a real risk that it would result in, for example, that increase in retirement age that Lord Frost has spoken about, a slash to the pensions budget, cuts to the NHS. And I really think the government need to come clear about how they think they would be able to pay for this. Otherwise, it is just a repeat of the Liz Truss recklessness that crashed the economy and has left people paying hundreds of pounds more a month in their mortgages.
Right, well...
It's not the case at all, because the cuts that have been put in place to national insurance, the £900... have been funded in the way that they're set out in the budget, and it's there for everyone to scrutinise.
Yes.
What we've said is, as and when the economy allows us to do this further, or other forms of tax reductions, we'll do that because we believe in cutting taxes and giving people more money in their pocket. And as for pensions, they've gone up by £900 as well, as a reduction in £900 in tax for the working age. So we're looking after both cohorts. And that triple lock, our triple lock, is something that's given pensioners more money. So I just don't accept the facts give any credibility to what you've just said there, Ellie.
But there isn't much clarity, is there, about it? And that allows, rightly or wrongly, Ellie, in this case, Ellie Rees for the Labour Party, to say, how will you fund it? Will it hit pensioners? That is what Nigel Lawson said back in the 1980s.
But that's why
it would harm pensioners. You know, are you going to extend the retirement age? Is it going to result in the state pension being halved in order to pay for it? And Ellie's right. If Labour were doing this, you'd be all over them like a rash.
Well, we are in terms of the 28 billion that we can't
well, all
see
right.
that.
Well, no, right, you answer about this.
With regards to the £9 billion that the NI reductions has so far cost, that's been put in the budget. A good example of, as and when we can afford the reductions, the economy can afford it, we will do that. And actually, Rishi Sunak stood on a platform against Liz Truss on the basis that he would be sensible and not risk the economy.
It's trust me. Trust me, I'll do the right thing. Well, but you can't say when it will be cut. You can't say how much it will cost and how it will be funded.
Because it's an ambition of ours to continue this progress that we have embarked upon. And so on that basis of it being an ambition, we're saying as and when we can afford to, it's a type of measure we'd look to do again because we want to reduce the tax burden on working families.
I mean, it just feels like more fantasy economics that crashed the economy previously.
But as a principle, to get rid of national insurance, to encourage work in the way to sort of parrot what Hugh has just said, what is wrong with that as a principle?
Well, the issue is, I mean, to start with, the tax burden is the highest it's been for 70 years, notwithstanding the recent cuts. Actually, people are paying more in tax than previously. But the thing about national insurance is that, first of all, it's used to calculate how much people have paid in to get their state pension, and it also funds pensions and the NHS. So there is a big issue here about if you scrap it. What happens to those things? What happens to pensions and the NHS? And I think people will feel very worried about that, actually.
Do you?
Well,
yeah, I do.
Well, it's an interesting figure, though, that by reducing by £900 the tax bill on the working individual, we're also putting up pensions by £900. So we demonstrate that we're looking after both.
All right, well, I don't think this issue is going away, certainly not with a general election, at some point in the second half of the year. But, Henry, I'd like to draw your attention to this story in BBC News. Ireland to redesignate UK as safe for asylum. Now, there's been this row with the Irish government. What's been going on?
Yeah, we haven't had rows with the Irish government for a little while. It takes you back to the Brexit days, really, you know, having a Prime Minister, albeit a different one to the Brexit years, at the dispatch box, taking a pop at the Irish government, as Rishi Sunak did there, using the old Brexit phrase cherry-picking. I won't dredge that up, but what's happened here is, look, lots of countries, including the UK, clearly are tackling illegal immigration and the issues of people coming to seek asylum in their countries. That is a global and particularly European phenomenon. But in recent days, the Irish government has raised particular concern about people coming to the Republic of Ireland across the Northern Irish border, the border with Northern Ireland, which, as we know, is not a border that has checks or things like that. But that was a big part of the Brexit debate. And they say that that is specifically because a lot of those people are afraid that if they stay in the UK, they will be deported to Rwanda. Now, Rishi Sunak, speaking at the weekend, said, fantastic, that shows that the Rwanda policy is indeed a deterrent. The Irish government, meanwhile, are saying that they want to overturn a ruling that they've had in their top court. Again, sounds a bit familiar with some of the things that have been going on here, which says that the UK cannot be a safe country for those people to be returned to, specifically because of the Rwanda policy.
Is the UK a safe country for Ireland to which asylum seekers can be returned?
Well, you know, it's for the Irish government to make that designation. But what I would
but do you think, in the Labour Party's view, do you think the UK is a safe country?
I think the issue here is actually a broader question about returns because, you know, the government ripped up the Dublin Agreement and didn't replace it with anything else. And that's now what's led to all of these wranglings. Now, I'm obviously not party to the discussions that have gone on between our government and the government in Ireland. But, you know, we've got rid of all the returns agreements. Returns have collapsed under the government. They're down something like 44% than when Labour was last in power. We've got huge backlog dialogue and no real plan to tackle this. You know, this idea that Rwanda's a deterrent, well, 359 people arrived on small boats on Saturday. That is more than the entire capacity.
But what do you think's motivating? But what do you think is motivating those asylum seekers in Northern Ireland to cross the border into Ireland?
Well, I can't answer that, and I think that, you know, one of the things that has been said is that that there isn't sort of statistical evidence as to, you know, what's caused this. It could be for a number of reasons, but when you've still got 7,000 people cross this year alone, 359 on Saturday, doesn't look like much of a deterrent to me. It looks like an unworkable scheme.
Right. I mean, it's quite something, isn't it, this situation where Ireland is trying to pass what looks like almost emergency legislation to deem the UK a safe country to return asylum seekers who are fleeing across the border from Northern Ireland because of a so-called deterrent to Rwanda. Well, as the Prime Minister made absolutely clear, there is no obligation on the UK to accept, and we will not do so. So, therefore, it doesn't really matter what the Irish may or may not determine. The power remains with us, and we will not accept that in the same way that the French, as another EU country as Ireland is, do not accept any returns from the UK. Right. What do you say to that, Ellie? What would a Labour government do? Well, I said before, you know, the Dublin Agreement was ripped up. It hasn't been replaced with anything. There is a real issue about making sure that returns agreements are in place with France and other countries. But the government hasn't tried to do any of that. They've not tried to negotiate those agreements. The Dublin Agreement went, nothing's replaced it. Right, but would a Labour government do a deal with Ireland? As you've said, you should have returns agreements in place. Well, I think it's also about doing, you know, speaking to France and having good faith conversations about all of that. Well, you know, it'd be very difficult to take people from Ireland but still not have anything where we can return people to France. I mean, in a way, as you have said, you want to establish more returns agreements. Can you guarantee, because you've said you would scrap the Rwanda scheme, the Rwanda deportation scheme, if Labour wins the election, how quickly would you get rid of it? The thing about the Rwanda scheme is that it's costing £500 million before anyone has been spent. Sure. It's and you want to get rid of it. Expensive. And you want to get rid of it. It's not workable. When would you get rid of it if you win? As soon as we possibly can. I mean, we don't think it's going to work. I mean, look, I don't want to talk about talking hypotheticals, but we don't even know if anyone's going to be sent to No, I understand that. But let me just show you what stage things would even be at. Let me just show you this piece in the New Statesman. Inside Labour's immigration dilemma, the party might keep the Rwanda plan until it has agreed a returns policy with the EU. That would, of course, include Ireland as a member of the EU. So might you not get rid of it for quite some time? We've been really clear that we don't think that the scheme is workable. But you might have to keep... It costs a huge amount of money and we would scrap the Rwanda scheme. Right. I mean, a senior advisor saying it may just not be possible to get rid of the Rwanda scheme if you win the election, certainly beyond 100 days. Would that be disappointing for you? We've been clear that we want the scheme scrapped, but we don't think it's going to work. We don't think it's a workable scheme. We don't think it's going to deter anyone, and that's why we would get rid of it and replace it with a proper scheme to tackle the small boats crisis and to have secure borders. So a cross-border police force, 1,000 new returns officers to get people back, and also 1,000 officers to clear the backlog. No, I understand, because I've heard Labour's proposal and plan, but the precise quote from this senior Labour advisor is, we can't just come in, tear it up, that's the Rwanda deportation plan, and have nothing to put in its place. I think that viewers of this programme and voters generally listening to Labour and its criticism of this Rwanda scheme probably expect you to get rid of it almost on day one. But you won't, will you? Well, we're going to scrap the scheme, and we've been really clear. But I'm not convinced that, you know, the scheme will even be up and running. Even former Conservative Immigration Minister Robert Jenrick has said that at most, you know, a symbolic flight might get off before an election. Even the Conservatives don't have confidence in this unworkable and hugely expensive scheme.
Surely the thing that would make the most sense is to wait and see if it does act as the deterrent. It is successful. We do see fewer people crossing, fewer people losing their lives. And then surely a responsible government, if that is working, would then look for it to continue. I mean, it would be extraordinary because you, at every stage through the divisional lobbies, have blocked the progress of this. But if it works, which I very much hope it will, and the Irish situation seems to suggest it does look to be a deterrent, and it saves lives, then why wouldn't Labour continue it?
We don't think it will work. And actually,
why not wait for the
Conservative
proof?
MP after Conservative MP, including former Conservative ministers, have all lined up to say why they don't think it will work. And at most symbolic gimmick flights will get off.
Well, we're about to find out.
Right, let's just talk briefly, because you are Transport Minister. BBC News train strikes announced for May bank holiday week. Yes, starting, I think, next Tuesday. More strikes, Hugh, more disruption for passengers. Why haven't you resolved this?
We've resolved all of the industrial action with the exception of the train drivers. So with the other three unions, it's taken down. Train drivers still in dispute. And actually, it's quite interesting because I can give you the comparison. So our approach is we need to have reform. We have a pretty inefficient structure. Still a lot of voluntary-led agreements and restrictive practices.
You've failed to convince...
We discuss with the unions as to how we can actually get that reform. Interesting, Labour's policy that came out last week is to have what they call a resource-based timetable fitting around the existing train practices. That means that you never improve the service.
Right, so we're going to look forward to more strikes.
Well, we are in discussions. I'm due to be meeting, actually, both Mick Lynch and Mick Whelan, actually, because I believe in discussions, and I very much hope that we can get agreement and get these strikes taken down.
All
but
right,
I think it's fair to ask.
Well, you've heard it from the Rail Minister. That's all we have time for today. Thank you to my guests. No Politics Live tomorrow because, as you know, it's election day. I will be back on Friday with our local election results special programme starting at noon, and then it moves on to BBC One from BBC Two between 1:45 and 4:30. Bye.